We go now to Republican Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, who joins us from Houston. Good morning to you, Senator.
Good morning, Margaret. Good to be with you.
Overnight, you did see Chinese state-run media release images of tennis player Peng Shuai in Beijing. It's the first time she's been seen in 2 weeks since she mysteriously disappeared after criticizing and claiming that one of the former leaders of China committed sexual assault against her. Do you have any idea what is going on here?
Well, we don't know for sure, but there are reasons to be deeply, deeply skeptical. Peng Shuai is one of the best tennis players in the world. She's the first Chinese player ever to be ranked @1 in the world in doubles for women's or men's. And she posted on social media a serious allegation of sexual assault by the former vice premier of China, by a former member of the Politburo Standing Committee. And within 30 minutes, the Chinese Communist government caused that accusation of sexual assault to miraculously disappear. And since that point, Peng Shuai has not been seen. Now,
should the U.S.
after
be doing
there was
more?
criticism, after everyone noticed she disappeared, they put out, there was an email that claimed to be from her that frankly read like a bad Saturday Night Live, like a hostage email. And these latest images that the Chinese government is putting out, they're trying to pretend everything is okay. But I got to say, the Women's Tennis Association has been extraordinary standing up to China. They have been defending this athlete. They've been calling on China to have full and complete transparency. And the Chinese Communist government is flabbergasted because they're not used to seeing sports leagues or big corporate interests stand up to them. I really commend the Women's Tennis Association for putting their players first.
Right, and I know you and I have talked about that in the past when sports leagues don't do that. So despite concern right now that China is carrying out actively a genocide against Muslims in that country, it's still set to hold the Olympics in 3 months. President Biden has said he's considering a diplomatic boycott. Do you think he should go further? Because other 2024 presidential candidates, and I know you are considered to be likely one of them, are really kind of competing to be as hardline as they possibly can on China. Nikki Haley, Tom Cotton say this should be a full boycott. Do you support one?
Yeah. So listen, I've been leaning in hard, saying we ought to move the Olympics out of China. That's what we should have done. The IOC refused to do that. I think it's a mistake to have a full boycott of the Olympics. You know, Jimmy Carter tried that in the 1970s. All it did was punish a generation of athletes. We've got young men and young women, Americans, who spent their whole lives practicing for this moment. I don't want to punish those young athletes. What we ought to do, I do agree with the notion of a so-called diplomatic boycott, which means we don't send high-ranking cabinet officials over there. We don't send, we try to minimize the attention. But I also think it's important we do two things at the Olympics in China. Number one, that we actually show the courage the Women's Tennis Association is showing to call out the murder, the genocide, the torture, the lies, the complicity in COVID-19 of the Chinese Communist government, to speak the truth. And then number two, I really hope our young men and women that they go over there and kick their commie asses. We need to win in the Olympics.
Okay. Putting that aside, there are, on a practical level, corporations who spend a ton of money on sponsorships around the Olympics. Coca-Cola, Google, Procter & Gamble, they're all Olympic sponsors. Should they still go ahead with those activities?
Look, I think it makes sense for corporations to cut off their ads. I'd love to see corporations show a tiny bit of courage. You know, when China engages in horrific slave labor, companies like Nike turn a blind eye. When you look at the NBA, I'm a diehard hoops fan. The NBA's reaction to China is terrible. They're terrified of upsetting the Chinese communist dictators. They value the money so much that in fact, you know, you and I both remember when Daryl Morey, who was the general manager of the Rockets, sent one little innocuous tweet about Hong Kong, and the NBA bent over backwards, groveling to the Chinese communists. I was in Hong Kong at the time. In fact, you and I did a show at that time where I dressed in all black in solidarity with the Hong Kong protesters.
Right.
I understand why the NBA did it. They're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. I understand why Nike does it. But, you know, what is really impressive about the Women's Tennis Association is they've said they will cancel their matches in China. They will give
Right.
up tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars if Peng Shui is not released, if there
Yes.
isn't transparency. That's the kind of courage we need other players to have.
Understand, and they are standing alone on that. I want to ask you about you're blocking
Yeah.
a number of President Biden's nominees to national security posts. The White House said it's an unprecedented effort of obstruction. Senator Murphy said talking to you is like dealing with a terrorist. Aren't you playing politics with national security?
Well, actually, quite the opposite. I'm trying to get President Biden to stop acquiescing and surrendering to our enemies. In China, I introduced an amendment to say that we should not purchase any green vehicles or solar panels made with slave labor in communist China, in concentration camps. Every Democrat but Joe Manchin voted against it. On Russia, one of the first things Joe Biden did was surrender to Vladimir Putin on Nord Stream 2. He gave Putin a multi-billion-dollar pipeline, a pipeline that we had stopped. I had authored bipartisan sanctions legislation. Democrats and Republicans overwhelmingly supported my legislation, and we killed that pipeline dead. Joe Biden came in and surrendered. It is, Margaret, I believe, a generational geopolitical mistake. If this pipeline is allowed to go online, it will give billions of dollars to Russia. They will use it for military aggression against America and our allies. It will undermine European security, American security, and it enriches Russia. And Biden simply surrendered to Putin. That was a mistake. And so I placed the hold on these nominees in order to try to pressure Biden to follow the law, I'll lift it when he follows the law. And in fact, I've suggested a simple, reasonable compromise, which is I've said I will lift many of the holds if he simply triggers under a law called CATSA, which is a Russian sanctions law passed with overwhelming bipartisan support. Under CATSA, he could list Nord Stream 2 AG, which is the umbrella company for Nord Stream, and then delist it. That would solve his political objective of surrendering to Putin, but it would trigger an automatic congressional override veto. I've said if they trigger the override veto, the vote, then I'll lift the holds. But the reason Biden doesn't want to do that is he knows, he fears he will lose the vote in Congress because his policy of surrendering to Russia is indefensible.
I want to keep talking to you, Senator. So I'm going to ask you to stay put if you could, because I have to take this break, and we're going to continue our conversation on the other side of it.